All right, let's dive into a piece of history that totally flipped the script on one of the world's most powerful military alliances. We're talking about NATO's very first war.
So here's a question for you. When do you think NATO actually fought its first war? I mean, your mind probably jumps straight to the Cold War, right? You know, the big standoffs with the Soviet Union, the constant threat of nuclear bombs. But is that really when the alliance first saw combat?
Well, the answer probably isn't what you're expecting. It's kind of wild, but for decades after it was founded back in 1949, NATO was a military alliance that had, believe it or not, never actually fought.
So the first time NATO ever went to war wasn't against the Soviets. Nope. It was years after the Cold War ended, back in the 1990s, and it was in a region that was just tearing itself apart, the Balkans.
I mean, just let that sink in. For more than 40 years, NATO was basically just a defensive promise, right? It was a shield held up against a potential invasion. This was the very first time that shield was put to the test in actual combat.
Okay, so that brings up a really big question. What kind of crisis could possibly push a defensive alliance to go on the offensive for the very first time in its history?
And you gotta remember, NATO was created to defend its members from an outside attack. That's it. Its whole purpose was deterrence, to be so strong that nobody would even think about attacking. But this mission? This wasn't about protecting a member's border. This was a decision to go into an active conflict. So yeah, the stakes had to be incredibly high.
And they absolutely were. The official reason, the big moral justification for this historic move, was to stop the systematic killing of people in Bosnia and Kosovo.
And let's be really clear about that word, genocide. This wasn't just a war. The claim was that this was a deliberate attempt to wipe entire groups of people off the map. That was the moral crisis the world was facing.
But here's the thing. The moral argument wasn't the only reason. There was another, really strategic reason that pushed the alliance to act. You could call it a dual mandate.
And this quote from the U.S. president at the time, Bill Clinton, really nails it. We act to prevent a wider war. See, the fear was that the conflict in the Balkans could just boil over, destabilizing the whole region and maybe even dragging other countries into a much, much bigger war.
So you've basically got two core motivations driving this whole thing. On one side, you have the moral imperative, right? Stop the genocide. And on the other, you have the strategic goal, prevent this thing from exploding into a wider war. It was those two ideas together that pushed NATO into its very first conflict.
But this mission did more than just end a conflict. It really started to redefine what NATO even was and what it could be in this new post-Cold War world.
This was the big one. It was a fundamental shift from just deterring an attack to actively intervening. For the first time ever, the alliance was showing the world it wasn't just a passive shield, it could also be an active sword.
And that one move changed NATO, like almost overnight. It went from an alliance built to protect its own members to a force that could step into conflicts way outside its borders. It was a completely new job description for the entire alliance.
All right, so what's the big takeaway here? What's the lasting impact of this decision? And what does this fundamental shift in global security really mean for us today?
So let's just quickly recap the main points. NATO's first ever war? Surprise! It was in the Balkans. It was kicked off for two big reasons: the moral case to stop a genocide and the strategic goal of preventing a much bigger war in Europe. But the most important thing to remember is that this one single mission forever changed NATO's DNA, and it set a precedent for everything that came after.
And that leaves us with a really critical question to chew on. By taking this step, by creating this brand new role for itself as a global intervention force, how did NATO's first war permanently change the rules of the game for everyone else? Because that's a legacy we are absolutely still living with today.